Good evening, and thank you for coming, Lake George Historical Association. Tonight we welcome Lyn Hohmann. She will present a presentation on Fort George Park, the history, and the artist's canvas. Okay, and I guess we'll begin. Thank you for coming. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Is the sound okay? Okay. So I want to thank you for inviting me here, Lake George Historical Association. And the first thing I want to say, I have never taken an art course in my life. My friend Brenda here will tell you that I am the world's worst artist. I fail at stick figures. But I'm hoping tonight to share with you some of the art that was associated with Fort George, that little fort that's sitting up in Lake George Battlefield Park. So that's what my goal is tonight. One thing I want to say is in 2005, the Hyde Museum actually did an exhibit of 45 paintings and other, I assume they weren't all paintings, but paintings and other artwork related to Lake George. Lake George has been painted so many times. And we think of the Hudson River group, the Hudson River painters. They didn't just paint the Hudson River, they painted Lake George. So some of these paintings you'll see will be of that group, and some of them will be kind of what I consider esoteric art. And when I say that, I want you to think of art in the broadest sense of the different ways art can be expressed in etchings, paintings, photography, and some other unique ones we'll get to as we go along. I do want to thank a big thank you to Dr. Russ Bellico. I've worked with him over the years, and he's been very graciously sharing with me a number of the art pictures that you're going to see. And I have to always say a thank you to him. I just spoke with him yesterday, as a matter of fact, on another picture that we were talking about. So first of all, why was the south end of Lake George important in the military colonial times? The other way is saying, why was it not important? And why it was not important is one of the reasons that Lake George, the Fort George in Lake George Battlefield Park is only a single bastion and not this big fort that they had planned. So why was it important? If you are going from New York City to Quebec in the colonial times, the easiest way to go was by water. Hudson River, you get off at Fort Edward, you carry your canoe and materials, a portage up to Lake George. You go up Lake George. You get to Fort Carillon, Fort Ticonderoga, depending which colonial period. You get onto Lake Champlain. You take Lake Champlain all the way up on a river, the St. Lawrence, and you're in Quebec. When you didn't have roads, that was the fastest way to go. Now, unfortunately, it was not the only way to go from New York to Quebec, and that is why this little fort was never finished. The other way to go is to go all the way to Fort Edward, just as I said, and then you, instead of going portaging to Lake George, you portage over to South Bay. You take South Bay, you're on Lake Champlain, you head up the same way heading up north. So if you really want to control the waterways, as a colonial government, you somehow have to control both of those waterways. And that, in the beginning, was not done. And that's part of the reason in 1755 that the Battle of Lake George happened the way it did, because the French did not come down Lake George. They came down Lake Champlain, totally bypassed Johnson, who was here in 1755, setting up his camp, hoping to drive the French out of Canada. So that's the reason this little fort never got finished. Well, one bastion got finished. Fort George was planned to be the largest fort in North America. Ended up as just a bastion, just like I said. Come on, why are we not switching? Come on. There we go. So what's the history of Fort George? Fort George was started in 1759 by General Amherst. The year before, in 1758, the English attempted to take Fort Carillon. The French attempted to drive again the French out of this area, the British areas. And unfortunately, they did very, very, very poorly. Abercrombie, I'd say he basically had a very bad disaster and never did make it any further than Fort Carillon. So in 1759, General Amherst was going to try the same thing again, but he was also going to try, he wanted to control Lake George, so he decided to build this fort at the south end of Lake George. He worked with Colonel James Montresor. They selected the site. William Brashear surveyed the site, consulted with Lieutenant Colonel Eyre, who was the person who designed and built Fort William Henry. All the materials for stones, limestone, clay are here, easy. Soldiers began construction. Walls were 14 feet thick. They were big walls. But on August 6th, Amherst had a much easier time going north. Because the French and Indian War was now the 7-year war, the French were much more focused on Europe, and they were not focused on North America, so they were not supplying their troops here. So the French at Fort Carillon, Fort Ticonderoga, were now short of supplies. They basically blew up the magazine and headed north. The Fort St. Frederick at Crown Point, same thing. They blew up Fort St. Frederick's Tower, headed north. So Amherst had a much easier time going north and driving the French ahead of him. When he got up to Crown Point, what is the difference at Crown Point than the south end of Lake George? In Crown Point now, you control that waterway from New York to Quebec totally, because now this little bypasses, Lake George, Lake Champlain, are no longer relevant, because you're up there where they both come together, far enough up in a narrow enough part of the lake. So he didn't need this big fort, Fort George. Sent a message down to the south end of Lake George, said, close up that bastion that you're building. The only thing they had built was the bastion. Close it up, finish it off, and come up north, because we're going to build His Majesty's Fort at Crown Point. That's why Fort George never got finished. So this is one of the first models, and I want you to think of this as artwork. The graphic artists that drew this were very, very skilled. Now this design of what they had thought Fort George might look like was never built, obviously, and this design was never even used. We don't know who did it, but this was in the property of King George III in England, so clearly he saw this piece of art, this design. Now what is... Why is this doing this? Okay. This is another beautiful little piece of artwork a graphic artist did. I have no idea what it is. Russ Bellico and I have argued about this many times. Neither of us really know what it was. This was supposedly a little, what do they called it? A post. It was supposed to be in the part, what's now Lake George Battlefield Park, but there's nothing in the Lake George Battlefield Park that looks like this. So it's very pretty, cute little design, very nice graphic artist, but it was never built. It's not there. This, however, is. This is, again, a beautiful graphic artist. This was done by William Brashear. This was showing the whole lay of land of Lake George Battlefield Park. You see, here is, I don't know if you can see my pointer. That is supposed to be Fort George. That was the plan for Fort George, and laid out in this beautiful drawing of what that area looked like. You have to think of these. These are artists doing this. William Brashear was 1689 to 1775. He was a British surveyor operating in North America. He is known to have done numerous maps. Not much is known about his life, but from 1758 till he died, he was considered one of the most talented surveyors of the British Army, working with General Lord Geoffrey Amherst. And during the Revolution, before he passed away, he was appointed deputy surveyor to the Board of Ordnance. He was a very talented surveyor. Now this little slide I tucked in here, this talks about the soldiers building the fort. But what I want to point out to you in the bottom, July 3rd, dug up 7 men's bones that were killed in the siege of Lake George in 1757. Someplace around Fort George, there are the remains of 7 soldiers who died during the 1757 massacre. Moving on. Oh, we'll figure this out. So this again is William Brasher's drawing. This is what they actually did build. And here, that is the only thing. You see, this is still in faded outline. That is Fort George. That little fort was the only thing that ended up from this biggest fort in North America, was this one little bastion. But somehow this bastion has gained the interest of people and artists ever since it was built in 1759. This is the actual drawing of Fort George. This is the plan. It was done by Francis Pfizer. He was another cartographer for the British. Sadly, Sadly, Pfizer, unfortunately, as an officer in the British Army, was in the battles coming down with Burgoyne, and unfortunately he died at the Battle of Bennington. So they lost one of their very skilled cartographers. So that's the story of Fort George. The French and Indian War was essentially over. Between the wars, there was a garrison. It was used during the Revolutionary War. It was the same time that Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold took Fort Ticonderoga from the French. They also, several days later, were able to take Fort George, this little bastion, from the British soldiers and Captain John Nordberg, who were there. 1776, the Lake George Battlefield Park was the the military hospital for the Northern Campaign. Colonel Peter Gansford was in charge of the fort. 1777, General Schuyler abandoned and ordered the evacuation of Fort George when Burgoyne was coming down from the north. General Washington was not pleased at abandoning this little fort, but Schuyler defended his action. And if you ever want an incredibly sarcastic letter from the American Revolution, I recommend you reading Schuyler's report back to Washington about this eminently defensible fort, which it wasn't. The British, once they had abandoned the fort, the British used that fort as a supply depot. Then, after the Battle of Saratoga, it came back into American hands. Last hurrah so stayed in American hands till 1780. At that time, Christopher Carleton, British soldier, British officer, was part of the group that was going to destroy the food basket for the American Revolution. So they came and they burned the Mohawk Valley, all the farms there that were owned by rebels, and they burned all of Charlotte counties, the same thing, any of the fields, to destroy the food sources for the American Army. They came to Fort George. There was a little struggle, the Second Battle of Bloody Pond. Basically ended up, the fort was surrendered by Captain Chipman. The fort was in terrible condition, was abandoned, forced to surrender. And after the Americans were allowed to take their supplies, their personal belongings out, the Native Americans were allowed to plunder the fort, and it was burned. It's interesting, when we did archaeology there were very few artifacts, and I think that's one of the reasons, is they were all gone. There wasn't much left. So, was that the end? That was the final hurrah for Fort George as a military site. However, somehow it has captured the imagination of Americans ever since that time, who are thinking about the battles of the Revolution and trying to recapture that story. So one of the first drawings, this is by Jared Sparks. This is a little drawing from 1830 of what was remaining. And you see here's little Fort George up in the corner. And just as the plan that you saw was. Jared Sparks was a historian, he was a minister, and he also was president of Harvard for a period of time. But in 1830, he decided to take a tour of Lake Champlain and Lake George, and he wanted to capture, draw, and see what was remaining of the military forts from the Revolutionary War, and that's why he drew this map, this drawing of Fort George at that period of time. He did measurements, and this is a good picture for us to see of what Fort George looked like after the war. Interestingly, he did describe bomb-proofs within the fort. He did describe some of these pieces that were in that drawing that I showed you of Fort George from 1759. One of the other things Sparks did is he was passionate about restoring the history, saving the history of the Revolution. And he went around and he collected as many of the papers of George Washington and the founding fathers as he could find. And I think that's one of the reasons, his passionate collecting, that we have so many of those papers in the National Archives. This was his work. So I'm going to show you the bomb proofs. These are the actual bomb proofs when we did the archaeology in 2015. So the plan that showed bomb proofs, Jared Sparks said they were there, and by gosh, there they are. This is David Starbuck down in one of the bomb proofs, was excavated during the excavation. This is another one. So they're there, and there's quite a bit of Fort George that still remains despite its destruction. It's what we excavated in 2015 has been filled in, so you can't go into the bomb proofs anymore. They're filled in because the plaster that they used, the mortar for this fort is really not very good. And if you leave it uncovered, it crumbles and falls apart. This is a picture of the barracks wall, which was consistent again with the drawing. The barracks was contiguous with the wall of the fort, and that's exactly what we found. So now we've done a history, we've done sort of those drawings, the graphic artists. Now let's get into some of the other art that came out of this. They never forgot Fort George. This is a perspective painting of Lake George, but interesting. This was done, it's hard to me, I have to walk back and forth. I wish I had a pointer. This was done in 1812 by Ezra Ames. Ezra Ames was in Albany, New York. He was a well-known portrait painter. He did something like 900 portraits of people in the Albany area. But he also did a few of these landscapes. Now this landscape, this is very interesting. He doesn't say he's doing it at Fort George, but I'm going to point to you. There is Fort George. So he's looking down, looking at Fort George, but also you see two little houses. Those two little houses are believed to be remaining barracks that were in the Fort George field at the time of the Revolution. And from other pictures I'll show you, one of those buildings became a tavern that existed for some period of time. We don't know when it came down. The other interesting thing about this painting is Ezra liked to do duplicates, apparently. So if he sold you a painting, he'd go into the back room and come out with another copy of the same painting. When he did this painting in 1812, which he did it was done for John Taylor, who wanted it for his home. John Taylor paid the mighty price of $25 for this painting. The frame itself was $25, so you can imagine. But he also painted a second one. And he sold that in 1822 to James Caldwell. What's different with that painting is that he blocked out Fort George. So that painting just shows the landscape and no Fort George. Is all painted over. I guess he wanted an original, but not quite original. I'll figure this computer out yet. This is a etching, a drawing that was done in 1813. This Dr. Russ Bellico has this original. We do not know where it came from. We do know it was from 1813. There is a name down in the corner, but honestly, I've tried, I cannot read it, and he hasn't been able to read it. But again, it was based on Ezra Ames' painting. If you see, here are the figures, and there are those same two buildings. So this might have been done as what we call a coffee table book. You know, we have a book of pictures, and you'll see a number of the pictures I'm going to show you later on were all from basically coffee table books, just like us, with our beautiful pictures of our trips and so forth. They did it of historical sites. This drawing, again, it's from Fort George. There's the buildings are still there. This was done by Daniel Wadsworth. It was done in, as it says, it was done in 1819. And it was in a book by Benjamin Silliman. Benjamin Silliman was a doctor, a geographer, a scientist, geologist, and he did a lot of traveling. And when he traveled with his friend, Daniel Wadsworth, who was an artist, an amateur artist, and Wadsworth drew what Silliman saw. And then they published these in multiple different books. That you can actually find this book on the internet. So this book was called A Tour to Quebec in the Autumn of 1819. Again, beautiful, beautiful picture. Very much in the vein of Ezra Ames' picture from Fort George. Now this picture and the next picture, these are they're basically two versions of the same picture. The artist was Jacques-Gerard Milbert, and lithographer, as it says, was Leon Jean-Baptiste Sabatier, done in 1828. It was a lithograph. This one, what's interesting in this one I believe is also done from Fort George, and I base it, here they are in Fort George, and we know that after the Revolutionary War, when Fort George was abandoned, that this area was farmed, and in fact sheep and so forth were grazing in what is now Fort George, what was then Fort George. So this is very likely, again, from inside of Fort George, showing the walls of Fort George. You could argue with me about that, but I think that's pretty clear. Now this, okay, not getting used to this. Now this one, Thomas Chambers, circa 1850. If you look at this is exactly almost the same picture as the one previously. Thomas Chambers was born in England from 1808 to 1869. English-born painter, obviously. He spent most of his life in the United States. He is generally classified as a primatist. And you can see that's kind of that kind of painting. But he's also been called the first American modernist. And again, you see, it's hard to believe that this was from the 1850s. But he uses the bright colors, the whole boldness of his colors, the lack of detail, the solidness of his designs. The problem with the problem with Thomas Chambers is that he didn't sign his pictures. So it wasn't until the middle of the 20th century that he even realized that this painting was one of Chambers. Because many of his were not signed, and they found one painting of his in a style with his name on it, and from there they were able to deduce back that a number of these paintings, these beautiful, bold, colored paintings, were actually Chambers. And this is actually based on that previous painting, that previous etching, Milbert's etching. This drawing here, again, I do believe, I may be on shakier ground here, but I do believe this is also done within Fort George. The walls. This was done by Rue de Rochelle. He was a French geographer, writer, poet, and an ambassador to the United States. He wrote several geographical and historical works, of which this print was contained in one of them, Les Estates Unis, the United States. This is, again, I assume more of like this was actually a book with his pictures in it. And this book is still available, believe it or not, on Amazon, in French, if you read French, by the way. I looked at it and was kind of lost. This is clearly in Fort George. You see the walls? And you see the sheep grazing. And there's the cow. Assume those are cows down there eating. And there's somebody sitting, looks like they have an umbrella over their head, they're watching the sheep. This painting was kind of interesting. This came up for auction a few years ago. And the person, I found it just after it was sold on auction. And the person who bought it was a local. And I actually had an opportunity to see it. And because of COVID and everything else, I never got to see it. But fortunately, this lovely woman donated it to the Hyde collection. So this painting is now in the Hyde. It is not on display, but it is there in their collection, and hopefully it will be shown in the near future. Russell Smith, again, he was born in Scotland, not England. Many of them came from England. 1812 to 1896 he lived. This is oil on paper. And again, it's a pastoral scene. It's the classic pastoral scenes, almost Hudson River type, with the human and the animals, as I pointed out. He was not as famous as many of the other people, but he was a highly respected artist in the Hudson River School. But what most of his pictures that he has done were actually done in Pennsylvania. So the gist of his stuff was all Pennsylvania. But he apparently did come up to Lake George and do this beautiful painting of Fort George. Forgive me, I am not in any way, shape, or form an art historian, so I do have notes, and I apologize. I don't like to refer to notes, but I kind of have to here. This is a wood engraving, Lake George from the top of Fort George. Again, you can see the walls of Fort George. It's that same picture of the walls and the center open, and several people standing there. This was done by William Rickerby Miller. This one was, again, an American-born artist, artist born in England, lived in 1818 to 1894, and this was a coffee table book. This was in like a coffee table book. This was in Gleason's, well, they were drawing rooms at the time. Gleason's Pictorial Drawing Room Companion from 1854. It's really, again, using Fort George. Why this little fort? This fort with this really minimal military history was so iconic to artists. It's just fascinating to me. This one I really don't know what to do with, but I think it is taken in the same area of Fort George. But you can see the cornfields, so they're obviously, that may be what became Fort George Road, the farm use of this area. This was done by Harry Fenn. He was 1837 to 1911 and moving along. He was again, English-born, American illustrator, landscape painter, etcher, wood engraver. And from 1870 to 1895, he was the most prominent landscape illustrator in America. And this picture may have been in volume 2, again, coffee table book, Picturesque America. This picture is from the Library of Congress, and I wish I knew more about it, but I could not find anything but this one. You can see I stole it from a seller. You see the graphics in the bottom. So I could not find a good copy of the original. Now we're going to move into a different type of art. After 1850, people really began to like the stereoscope. With the stereoscope, and you probably have all seen these, they would take two pictures slightly apart, so that when you look through the stereoscope, they would be in 3D. And this became extremely popular. Thousands of stereoscopic images were taken from the mid to the late 1800s, even into the 19th century. And they were here taking them in Lake George. This was, again, part of people wanting to see their history, and Fort George being one of the things they wanted to see in their history. So this one, unfortunately, I don't have the original of this that shows the two pictures of this particular one. This is a side view of Old Fort George. This is the back of it. I have the back and I don't have the front, which I don't quite get, but and the series is called Wanderings About Lake George. There's three that you'll see were all in that same class. And this is the picture. You see, this is the walls of Fort George. If you're going to take a picture, you need people in it. So there's this lovely couple standing on the walls of Fort George, obviously tourists, seeing their part of the Revolutionary War history. The next picture is view from the parapet of Old Fort George. You see the two images, and I really think those couple is the same couple. If you go back, I don't know if I can go back. They sure look like the same couple, so it looks like they came one day, took a group of pictures, and published them. View from the parapet, so they're up on the walls of Fort George. And again, it was Wanderings About Lake George, the same series, and this is in the New York City Library collection. This is the last one that I was able to find. It's, again, American Scenery, Lake George. It says Old Fort George, but I'll be darned if I can see Fort George in there. All I see is trees. Now, the trees, if you might have noticed in the pictures as we move forward, there were very few trees, and then there got to be a lot more trees, much like the park is today. During the battle years, they would not want any trees around the fort, so they would have taken them all down. But gradually, as this became more pastoral, the trees grew back, and there they are. But I still don't see Fort George in there. They also, illustrations were found in books. And this one by B.F. DaCosta is a kind of a classic about Lake George, the scenes and characteristics with glimpses of olden times. Schroon Lake and the Adirondacks. So he wrote this book talking about the history and illustrated with pictures that he drew around his travels around this area. And there is the citadel of Fort George. So he again drew it. Now something was happening in the beginning of the 20th century, when people became aware that they're all visiting Fort George and they're all drawing it and they're seeing it, but it is falling down and it is becoming, not a very viable place anymore. And people began to want to reconnect with their history and rebuild their history. When you start to see things starting to, wanting to save things, remember our history and take care of it. This next picture is from 1905. Look to my notes. Oops. This photograph of Fort George, again, from 1905, and it was found in the National Archives. Well, there is a name under the photograph. I can barely read it. But what's interesting, the same photograph was in a 1900 report, the annual report of the Society for the Preservation of Scenic and Historic Places and Objects to the New York Assembly. And I found another one from 1910. So they're starting to take pictures of the ruins of the fort, and this was beginning to talk about the recommendations to preserve the fort. So these all, I think, were all about preserving the fort, showing people how it was falling down and that it now needed to be saved. Something needed to be done. Again, here's the ruins. This is the circa 1920. This is just before they began to do work on the fort. This is looking in the north. And finally, in 1920, this is for the New York State Library. It's the official photograph of the building of the walls construction of the walls of Fort George. Now here is a very similar picture. This one I think is kind of, I figure where I am here. Again, it's the very same picture, but this one was done by the Delaware and Hudson as part of their advertising campaign. So they were promoting this rebuilding of Fort George to bring tourists in, I'm sure. I think that's kind of, you know, people were interested. This is a way to pull tourists into our history. This photograph, again, I still think of photographs as art, called the Fort Ruins at Lake George Battlefield. This was in the New York Archives digital collection and was taken in 1938 as a record of the historic sites activities of the New York State Conservation Department. So obviously they were having to report to the state what they were doing to preserve this fort, this little bastion of a fort. And I love there's a flagpole up there. There is no longer a flagpole on Fort George, and it looks pretty much the same way it does today. Now, if you're going to bring tourists in, you need to sell them postcards. So this postcard, documented to be 1921, again shows the reconstruction, and it was used, you know, if you were a tourist, you came and bought the postcards and you sent them to your friends and said, here I am in Lake George, and here is this Revolutionary War fort and the reconstruction of it. Kind of, again, just like the Delaware and Hudson bring the tourists in, postcards bring the tourists in. This is, and please forgive me for the poor quality of this picture. I tried to get a decent picture. It's hanging on the wall in the visitor center. This was painted by Tim Cordell, who is a historian and artist based in Queensbury, New York. It was just painted a few years ago. His paintings have appeared in works by Russ Bellico, Joe Zarzinski, and David Starbuck. And he painted this picture specifically for the Lake George Battlefield Park Visitors Interpretive Center. And at the time, I mean, we were just amazed that he did this and very gracious that he's loaned it to us to have on the walls of the Vic. Now I'm going on to another type of artistic pieces of this little fort, and that is the model. And here is the model of Fort George. Again, you do sculptures as art, you do models as art. This was done by the late Rick Conley, based on the plan that I showed you very much earlier that was done of Fort George. This is on display in the Vic at this time, and it's very realistic based on what we know about the design of the fort. Now I'm going to go on to another esoteric, perhaps, type of art, and this is the LiDAR. LiDAR is used to, it's light detection and ranging. And as you fly an airplane over an area using LiDAR, it washes out the trees, so all you see is what's on the ground. And they've used it extensively in Central and South America to show the different villages that are hidden in the jungle. So if you look at a LiDAR picture, you look at a picture, you see a jungle. You look at a LiDAR picture, you see buildings and temples. It's really amazing if you've ever looked at an archaeology book and seen what LiDAR does. This is a LiDAR of Fort George. And actually this LiDAR is part of a statewide project, so it's readily available. There's our little fort. Those lines there are likely the entrenchments from 1757, but there also might well be some of the beginning laying out of the walls of the large Fort George that was never built. You know, people back then were just as practical as they are today, and if someone had built a wall, why not use the wall that was already built? And we know during archaeology that there was mortar found in some of the rocks, which again suggests that yes, it may have been the entrenchments, but they were damn convenient sitting there, so we might as well use them for the beginning of the walls of Fort George. And this is the last piece of artwork. This is a drone, excuse me. This is a drone picture of Fort George. Beautiful. I'd have this hanging on my wall if I could. Here's Fort George. Absolutely beautiful. Excuse me. This was done for me by Gary McPherson, who is a DEC drone pilot. I was doing a study of the stockaded fort, and Chuck Vandry, who was the late Chuck Vandry, had Gary McPherson come so I could see aerially what the stockaded fort looked like. And while we were talking, he flew the drone up to Fort George and took these beautiful pictures. It's really a beautiful picture. So that ends the art of Fort George. I hope you found it somewhat interesting.
I just wanted to say that any of these people here have never been to the park where you're talking about.
Yeah.
It's a 10-minute walk. And it's absolutely stunning. Statues that are there.
Right.
And the history of that area. If you don't know, you're missing.
Have you been in the new visitors center?
But
Have you been in the new visitors center?
no.
Oh, well, that's kind of the best part.
Yeah. Yeah.
Where the model is. Yeah. No, not on the corner, but in the
Yeah,
park.
in the park. Yeah.
Yes, I know. Yeah.
Huh?
Very far, it's something I never realized. I love this viewpoint of it.
Well, it's when I rushed out of my house, I was supposed to bring a copy of the Ezra Ames painting. It's a print that I had made at Albany. I can't even speak. Albany Institute of History and Art, and I have it on loan to the Visitor Center. And I had it at home. I picked it up to bring it, and I was rushing around, and in the heat, totally forgot it. Or it would be sitting here, and you could see it up close. Incredible. But what I was amazed at when you go to Albany Institute of History and Art, when you go to the Lake George Historical Association's annual dinner, you got to watch out for people, because as you're enjoying your dinner, they go, oh, by the way, do you want to do a talk? And, you're chewing your meal and having a wonderful time. You go, oh, sure. And then you go, okay, what am I going to talk about? And then the more I explored the artwork, the more I found. And I was absolutely intrigued. If you look at art in a very expansive way, that little fort that was, not terribly useful turned out to be, very much on the artist's mind in every different type of way that they could draw it or include it in a drawing. And I just found that absolutely fascinating. And I know ever since I even finished this, I found some more drawn pictures of where Fort George has been incorporated into historical drawings. And I say, I never thought about the coffee table books, but apparently that was a big thing. Your parlor book where you showed the places that you wanted to be. So unfortunately, I've never taken an art course, so this is all very new to me, but I was absolutely fascinated by the number of different things where Fort George had been utilized for the artists. So any questions? I did go through that kind of a little fast, but I'm happy to re-show any picture that somebody would like to see. And the little houses that became a tavern, that were part of the original grounds of Fort George. I think that Russ Bellico and I had a nice discussion about that yesterday, about it's something we need to explore a little bit more and find out, what actually happened to those buildings. If you look at the archaeology in Fort George along Fort George Road, there are two areas that were foundations, but we think they were soldiers' huts. And it wouldn't have been big enough for those two buildings, but those are the only two foundations I'm aware of. But who knows? We just need to do more work there. So, any other questions?
It's interesting to look at the topography in some of those paintings. Some of the artists took great artistic license to make the mountains around Lake George quite different than they are, and other artists really had them pretty accurate.
Oh, yeah. Yes, I mean, it was...
Very,
And the thing I found fascinating is that one artist who, I don't know that he came to Lake George, but he took that previous etching and he drew his picture with those bold colors from that very, what I think, plain looking etching. I think it's just fascinating. Yeah.
Well, there's in painting, there's realists that will paint it as it's real.
Yep.
And then you've got your impressionists, and they look at a scene, a landscape, and they pick out what their impression is. So really, each painting is going to be different because part of the artist is going to be
their interpretation.
Yeah. It's their interpretation.
Yeah, this is Thomas Chambers. Look at that. And he drew it from that picture. Now he probably came here, but I don't know, but it is known that he based it on that picture, which and look at the difference, how different the boldness of the colors are in that.
There's no cliff on the left shore like that.
Well, but that's the mountain, and see the mountain there. Oh, see how my pointer works. See the mountain there, and then when he does it, it's just much more impressionistic up the mountain. So. Yeah. So, I do hope that they put this one on exhibit. It's a pastoral scene using Fort George as it was in those years when it was farmed. What I think would be nice, and I said it earlier, is if the Lake George Historical Association did an exhibit which showed some of these different pictures. Maybe the Albany Institute would loan a picture, and maybe Hyde would loan a picture, or work with them to do it, and bring some of these other pictures in so that people can see how artists use these historical sites as they move forward.
Did you know about the Hyde exhibit called Painting Lake George from a few years ago?
That was 2005. I talked about it in the beginning. Yes, that was 46 paintings that were of Lake George. I spoke about it earlier because that's where they really pointed out that the Hudson River artists painted Lake George. They didn't just paint the Hudson River, but it was that style of painting they brought north here. And there are almost more paintings of Lake George than there were of some other areas. So. Yeah, but they definitely liked, we liked Lake George, right? So they liked Lake George. What we liked, they would have liked. So, okay. Any other questions? And again, I am not an artist. I never took art history, so this is all very new to me. I never used notes, and today I had to use notes, which is, oops. Those are all the work that I did. Oh, in the sea to pull up.